Good evening. My name is Elena Sudakova. I'm a director here at Pushkin House. Thank you for joining us here tonight as we continue a series of events exploring history, ideologies, and myths in the context of the war in Ukraine. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce Simon Franklin, who is one of Pushkin House trustees. But apart from that, Simon is Professor of Slavonic Studies at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow of the British Academy. His publications range from the history of culture of early Rus to 20th century Russian poetry. For many years, he lectured on 19th century Russian literature, with particular emphasis on Pushkin, Gogol, Lermontov, and Tolstoy. He's currently working on a major book on the cultural and social aspects of information technologies in Russia between 1415 and 1850. And from 2004 to 2009, Simon was a chair of Pushkin House Trust, and he is actually responsible for the fact that we're here sitting in this building and for the move from Ladbroke Grove. Thank you, Simon. The floor is yours.
Thank you. No, you can decide afterwards whether it's worth applauding or not. Is this okay for the people online?
Yeah, it's perfect. We can edit if we left the speaker.
Okay. That way.
I mean, to the stand. If you can move it a bit left, then right, sorry. A little more. More. A bit more. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I may pick this up and walk around afterwards. Okay. Good. I need this. If you'd been walking past the US consulate in St. Petersburg in June 2015, you might have come across a small demonstration with this placard, "Sha ruki proch at Kievской Rusi," USA, hands off Kyivan Rus. Motherland, freedom, Putin. It seems kind of surreal even then. I mean, this is an objection to American influence in Ukraine, but what on earth has that to do with Kyiv, and I will use both those forms advisedly, Rus? Why is it there? It needs some kind of decoding, but if one had gone from Petersburg to Moscow just a few months later, one would have seen this, the newest monumental statue in the center of Moscow and the largest single figure monument in central Moscow to Vladimir of Kyiv. To give you a sense of the location, it's just under the Kremlin walls. It can hardly be more prominent and hadn't been there before. There had, of course, been a monument to Vladimir or rather Volodymyr, which had been within Russian imperial space until relatively recently, and that's there. And to give you a sense of location, he's overlooking the Dnieper River in Kyiv. That was constructed in 1853, still, of course, in Russian imperial space. If you want to find a monument to Vladimir or Volodymyr not constructed in Russian imperial space, the nearest one you can find is in London, outside the Ukrainian Institute, put up in 988, and I will come back. More to the mic, because people online, sorry, people online can't hear me properly. I will... That way. Okay, good. So, how do we get to this dialogue of monuments, or this polemic of monuments, or indeed placards talking about a 1,000-year history? Why this apparent mutual obsession with something which happened or didn't happen 1,000 years ago? Does history itself help to explain or resolve that kind of dispute, or to tell us who's right or who's wrong in what sense? Or is history completely irrelevant? In theory, if you ask the question, whose is early Rus, and a caveat here, the phrase Kyivan Rus or Kyivan Rus is not a medieval term, that's a later explanation, so to speak. So one could use early Rus or pre-Mongol Rus, meaning before the Mongol conquests. Simply in the abstract, one could say that there are four, before we begin to investigate, four possible answers. One is that Rus is Ukraine and not Russia. One is that Rus is Russia and not Ukraine. One is that Rus is both Russia and Ukraine. And one is that Rus is neither Russia nor Ukraine. And that's the full set, okay? That's the spectrum. But my aim today is not to give you the right answer, but to show how these questions arise and how they became important and what their status is between history and ideology. And before I move on to an element of history, and I'll deal with, to some extent, both, I need to say, I think, something about what I mean by history. Another big topic itself, we could have a course of 19 lectures on what is history. But I think it's in this context, the word is used so wantonly that it's important to know where we are on the spectrum of things that history could be. And very broadly speaking, and of course there's lots of intervening stages, there are three ways of approaching history. One is exploration, investigation. History is somewhere where we are not. History is, in H.E. Bates' famous term, the past is another country, they do things differently there. One investigates the past in order to expand our understanding of the human condition, expand our knowledge, expand our sense of experience, and so on. It is finding out about other things without worrying about where identities are. So that's exploration, that's the purest. Second, there's explanation. So we use the exploration in order to think about how things happen, particular things in particular places, things in general, or indeed, moving nearer to ourselves, how things came to be as they are, how the present came to be as is, and so on. It can be quite a self-centered explanation, though it doesn't have to be. And the third, moving to the opposite end, the other end of the spectrum, is after exploration or investigation and explanation, justification. Justification. Things were thus in the past, therefore they should be thus in the present and future. And here we move off really the scale of the historical as such. What tends to happen is that the past then becomes not a tool for explanation, but a kind of menu of possibilities from which one will pick the things which best suit the narrative one wants to tell about self. Now, it's not always disreputable. For example, I mean, the British legal system, which is based on precedent, has at its heart, this is the way things have happened, therefore, this is how we interpret and prescribe in the present. But that is according to a set of well-established, socially validated rules and norms. So precedent as a prescription for action is not necessarily relevant. But in history, we tend to shade into what one might call historical mythologies. Now, mythologies don't have to be lies. You can build up mythologies on perfectly accurate statements. The point is their function. They're there to justify who people feel themselves to be. They're there to justify claims and so on. And so the relationship between history as investigation and explanation, and history as justification mythology, is a complicated one. I think when we look at historical statements, we should try and to understand where they're coming from, where they are in that statement, because people persuade themselves that the latter is the former. This happened in the past, therefore. No, that therefore is a very, very tricky step. So, let's start today by going back to the remote past, which, to my astonishment, when I started exploring it a very long time ago, becomes current events. And we're not even going to start in early Rus. Who got there first is sometimes a question people put when trying to justify. We're going to go back to a time when there was nothing there that you would recognize as big space. There are different geographical zones, climatic zones, zones of vegetation. In the north, the thick forests. In the south, the enormous expanses of the steppes. In the middle, the kind of mixed forest steppe zones. But inhabited, they support different kinds of ways of living, different cultures, and inhabited by quite different peoples. In the north, largely Finnic peoples. In the south, on the steppes, largely Turkic peoples, and in the middle, largely Slavs, with no particular reason to imagine that any of them should be connected. So one wants to get away from the idea that any current country is intrinsic, so to speak, that it always had to be there. Something happens to give that space coherence, to bring it together. It's not inevitable, it doesn't have to be there. And what happens? It's not that this is an incoherent swamp, so to speak. There are communities, there are people carrying on economic lives, there are people growing crops, there are people pasturing cattle and so on in different ways. There are people in the north who are harvesting furs from the forests and so on. And there are some quite elaborate local structures. But what brings it together more than anything from the 9th century onwards is that purple or pink line down the middle of that map. It's long-distance trade. People traveling from Northern Europe to Southern Europe through those areas. And this is from Scandinavia. This is the Eastern Vikings. This is part of the Viking expansion, part of the Viking traders and raiders, same as in this country, same as in France and so on, expanding to the east. And traveling through these lands along the rivers, first of all, actually to the east, but the one which is crucial for what we're talking about is that north-south axis between the Baltic and the Black Sea. They were not interested initially in the lands we now think of as Ukraine or Russia or Belarus. They were interested in getting to the other sides of that. But in order to do that, you needed organization, you needed settlement along the way, you needed interaction with local populations. And the principal settlements, your boats needed repairing, you needed provisions and so on. In particular in the south, as you move out over the steppes, people by steppe nomads who didn't necessarily reckon you had a right to go through their lands, you needed fairly large numbers, organized expeditions and so on. And the principal settlements are in the north Novgorod and in the south Kyiv, not as centers, but as the entry and exit point, so to speak. Kyiv as the southernmost fortified point. I don't know how many of you have been there, but it's on a high hill overlooking the river, fortified before you go out into the open and undefended steppes. Novgorod, the entry to the northern river roads. And the earliest kind of organizational structures really grew out on that backbone, that axis. The population settled. I'm going to be covering far too many centuries far too quickly. It's all far too crude. Forgive me. I've got lots more centuries to come, which I'll pass over much more quickly than this, but we need to know where we are at the moment. And things kind of, the settlements along that route become the staging posts. They intermarry with the local populations. They become embedded in, they start extracting tribute from the local populations. The protection racket known as taxation, when tribute turns into taxation, is purely a matter of ideological legitimacy. And I'm not talking about the formation of a state as such. I mean, there are all sorts of crude statements that, the Vikings founded the first Rus state. In 882, Oleg came down and said, all of that is not really worth giving too much time of day to. But as a catalyst for giving coherence to this space and providing links between the settlements, they were a very crucial thing. Now, so the river roads, there were trade routes, the path as it appears in the Chronicles from Varangians to Greeks, and gradually it thickened out until by the time you get to the later 12th century, that kind of shaded area is controlled by the descendants of the ruling family which had dominated that trade route, moving to the west and to the east and to the north in particular, not absolutely right the way down the south. And then, just to give some sense of it wasn't a unitary state of any kind, what are sometimes thought of as principalities, those are very false boundaries there. It was much more fluid. These were spheres of influence which were constantly shifting, but insofar as it's useful sometimes to put these things onto a map, you had a cluster of what tend in retrospect to be called principalities, and you can see where they are there. Now, okay, we're giving this coherence in a sense. The integration that happened over this period was partly economic, partly linguistic, and then eventually cultural and faith, because the crucial event, in a sense, in the late 10th century was the official conversion to Christianity taken from Constantinople. And with that came writing. And one of the things which the early writers, principally the Kyivan writers, vexed themselves over was to do, in a sense, what we're doing from a greater distance, was to say this is, we've become Christian. Christianity opens up dimensions of time and space which were and where they were, was a principal preoccupation of the early writers of early Rus. Now, why should we care about the historical myth-makings in the conscientious and really very impressive endeavors of bookmen in the 11th century who had nothing to go on and had to invent it for themselves? And I'm going to give you one or two simply textual slides to begin with, just to give a sense of the shape that they were putting on it. At the most abstract level, the ideological level, the theological level, Ilarion of Kyiv, Metropolitan of Kyiv in the mid-11th century, sermon on law and grace, and he divided, you had to find a justification in the Bible, had to find a justification in the Bible, and he took the contrast between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It was the age of the law, the sea, all the way through, and those who come at the 11th hour shall be honored as much as those who come in the 3rd hour or the 4th hour, whatever it says in the parable. So the last shall be first and the first shall be last. So we are absolutely as dignified as the ancient Christian civilizations of Byzantium and so on. The fact that we've only just appeared on the fringes and the horizon of the Christian world deprives us of no dignity. So this was a way of finding a dignified identity for the Rus in Christian theology. In a way, the more influential schemes were in the early Chronicles, the people who tried to do the exploration as well as the explanation before they got to the justifications. And the work known as the Primary Chronicle, written put together in the form we know it in the early 12th century, in a monastery in Kyiv, in the Caves Monastery, produced a whole series of themselves among the Yaphatids, the peoples of the west and the north, whom they included the Slavs, and then the Polyani who lived around Kyiv, and then the Rus. So they found a kind of ethnic genealogy which went back to the Bible, finding themselves in sacred history. It was important to be in sacred history, not just in contingent time, so to speak. Then there's a story of a ruling dynasty, Rurik the Varangian, invited in notionally by the people of Novgorod, who, as the story goes, our land is great and abundant, but we have no order here. Come and rule over us, because, we Slavs, what do we know about running a place, so to speak? And that is the story which has caused most grief in thinking about foreign influences in state organization. Not a good thing, by and large. Anyway, and there are gaps in the genealogy, but you get a genealogy which, broadly speaking, goes back to Rurik the Varangian. And it's important that he was invited in. That's part of the story. This is a choice. This is not an imposition. That's the point of the story. Then you have a sequence of faiths. You have Ilarion's Old and New. You have a local story of pagan Slavs and Rus superseded by Christianity, but you also superimpose that onto the ethnic story, which puts the Rus in a line with the other Slavs who'd actually also converted to Christianity. Cyril and Methodius, apostles of Slavs, first translators of the Gospels into Slavonic, originally from Moravia, but then Bulgaria in the 9th century, so part of Slav Christianity, which already existed in a ready form. Okay. And then you have a chronological sequence going back to the creation of the world, which, as you know, happened in 5,500 before the birth of Christ. The proofs are all there, but just for fun, because there are miscalculations in various places, if you want to convert the date from the foundation, from the creation of the world, to the Anno Domini date, you actually subtract 5,508 according to the dating system used in Rus. I think I was seeing today the pictures which the James Webb telescope has just taken about the origins of the universe. Was it 13.7 billion years ago? It's rubbish. 5,500, you don't need any more than that. I mean, and the universe is mostly dark matter. They don't know about it at all. So it's all invention. Anyway, and then so they fitted themselves. You have symbolic time, as in Ilarion's theological structure, and you have linear time, and they map onto each other, which goes forward and forward and forward until the end of the world. So all these myth-making devices converge very impressively in the mid-11th century to create a powerful national narrative of early Rus. Now, very briefly, what happened next? In the eastern part of early Rus, the Mongol invasions of the 13th century and beyond, you can see Russian principalities up there in the top corner, but the Mongols controlling more or less everything. You know, we could talk about Russia as historic Mongolia as well as historic Russia or whatever. In the east, the expansion of Lithuania and Poland, which split between them the early lands of early Rus, which divide down the middle there. Muscovy that's sort of late 15th century Muscovy, early 16th century Muscovy expanding, but you have in the south still the remnants of the Mongol Empire, the Khanate of Kazan, the Khanate of Crimea, expansion to Crimea much later, and Lithuania and Poland, and eventually the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, within all those changes, two things I want to draw attention to. One is that you have, within the Slav populations, textual continuities and cultural continuities. So the stories, one of the reasons I dwelt on these stories of self, is that they weren't locked off in the early chronicles from the 12th century. The point about the primary chronicle is the way that chronicles were written right through the Middle Ages. They weren't thought of anew to tell different stories. They were copied and new bits were added on to the end. And they were copied in different places, but keeping the same bit at the beginning. So you can have a chronicle in Suzdal or Vladimir or Moscow, and a chronicle in Kyiv or Halich, and they all start with the same story. And that's not a decision, it's not a claim, it's just a sense of this is where we've come from, this is what we add. So this is a kind of de-ideologization, if you like, of simply continuity from common origins, split down the middle there. And there was no, this didn't come with claims of any sort, particularly when this was happening, until, and this is a fundamental change, in the late 15th and early 16th century in Moscow. And what happened in the late 15th and early 16th century in Moscow is that these stories continued to be copied, but they were given an extra dimension. And they were given what one might call an imperial dimension, quite deliberately. This was the first kind of deliberate transformation of the common tales of origins. And I won't go into great detail, but I'd just like to focus on one brief set of stories which will seem obscure, but I'll explain, you'll see why it's important. And it's a tale called The Tale of the Princes of Vladimir. And what it does is add two components to the common origin stories. One is a tale of imperial succession from Byzantium. And the imperial succession from Byzantium is that Constantine IX Monomachos, Emperor of Constantinople, sent imperial regalia to the Prince of Kyiv, Vladimir Zelensky Monomach. Now, Monomach was from the same family as Constantine Monomachos. So the baptism from Byzantium via Rus, and the rulers of Moscow, because it was Monomach's son Yuri Dolgoruki, and then Andrei Bogolyubsky after that, they were seen as the founders of Moscow, the imperial crown from Byzantium. And the Shapka Monomacha, with which Russian Tsars were crowned, is there in the armory of the Moscow Kremlin. All of this is rubbish. Nothing was given by Constantine IX Monomachos to Vladimir Monomach. Couldn't be, because they lived at different... Constantine was dead at least 20 years before Vladimir Monomach took the throne, and this is not a 12th century artifact. It's no earlier than the 14th century, and probably Turkic and Mongol. So this is it's not me. This is known. It's not. But the myth worked nevertheless. So you have symbolic transfer of regalia of power to Moscow, an imperial transformation of the story of dynastic and origins coming from Kyiv. You also have a change in the dynastic narrative, because Rurik, it turns out, Rurik the Varangian, if you look hard enough, turns out to have been descended from a relative of Augustus. Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Well, who would have thought it? Who would have guessed that you have regalia from old Rome, from New Rome, Byzantium, Constantinople, and you have direct dynastic descent from old Rome, from Augustus, from Rurik to the rulers of Moscow. Also rubbish, of course, but why is this important? It's an amusing story. It would be an amusing story. But this story was not just some ideologist's fantasy. If you go to the Cathedral of Dormition in the Moscow Kremlin, you see that, which is the royal pew. It's where Ivan the Terrible, Ivan IV, sat. 16th century royal pew, where he had his coronation. And you can't see in detail there, but those friezes on the outside of it are panels depicting scenes from the tale of the Prince of Vladimir, and on the front of it you actually have textual panels which tell the story. So Ivan the Terrible, the first Muscovite formally designated or crowned Tsar, Shapka Monomacha and so on, sitting there in the central cathedral, surrounded, literally wrapped in the text of this imperial story. You can't get closer to the heart of imperial myth than that. And that is a fundamental transformation, because not only is it imperial, but it implies, as the previous Chronicle versions did not imply, exclusivity. There was a special link specifically to Moscow from the stories inherited mutually from Kyiv. Now, I'm going to skip over a little bit what's a very interesting period that I gather there was a fascinating talk about a week or so ago here, which is the beginnings of the Ukrainian cultural revival in the early 17th century. Ukraine within, first of all, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, major center of Latin and Greek learning, based on Jesuit systems, but retaining orthodoxy and indeed Greek Orthodoxy, the Uniate faith, particularly based in Kyiv. The sense of learning at the former Caves Monastery, the academy under Petro Mohila, and continuing through as the base for the new, really the first for a long time, dialogue between Ukraine and Moscow in the later 17th century, following the annexation by Moscow of West Bank Ukraine, including on the right bank Kyiv, and the relationship between educated, colonized elites and the imperial center is often very multi-layered and complicated. And on the one hand, there was a very significant in visual culture, in engravings, in pictorial culture, in architecture, a significant Ukrainian presence in Moscow. Also in writing, many of the Muscovite bookmen of the second half of the late 17th century were trained in Ukraine, Belarus, including those who were most eloquent in devising the new Russian imperial ideologies, and were involved in Peter the Great's education and so on. But these are complicated stories, complex relations, I say, between the colonized and colonizing centers where the careers were to be made at the center. But I want to move on now to much more recent times. That is then, and it's the process of the emergence of some of these really powerful stories. They don't lie dormant over the next several hundred years. We saw the erection of the statue of Volodymyr in Kyiv in the mid-19th century. Second half of the 19th century was a period of very significant Russian recreation of Ukrainian monuments and pictorial traditions in the Russian tradition, so to speak, through the churches of St. Volodymyr in Kiev, through the repainting of the Kirillskaya Tserkov in Kiev, and so on. Major imperial projects there involving some of the finest Russian artists as well. But I want to move on actually to events of about 40 years ago, 30 years ago, because a lot of this lay dormant through much of the Soviet period. A lot of it lay dormant. And I think it's important to remember that for much of the Soviet period, it lay dormant because people didn't really imagine that there wouldn't be a Soviet Union for a long time. I mean, lots of people say, oh yes, I knew. Well, sort of, yes. Everybody is wise in retrospect. You know, it's always something people can kind of play around with. But it wasn't practical, it wasn't serious. And the catalyst, the event, the series of events that first gave space for these sorts of discussions, for these sorts of themes to air, was the millennium of Christianity in Rus in the late 1980s. And the point about the millennium of Christianity in Rus in the late 1980s was that it coincided, as it happened, with the high point of glasnost perestroika. Not merely did it coincide with the high point, it became one of, I think, the two principal tests of glasnost and perestroika, apart from the current political discourse. One was Chernobyl, which attempt to silence but eventually couldn't. The millennium was first meant to be a kind of small celebration for the church. If the church wanted to celebrate its millennium, that was fine, but it had nothing to do with us, nothing to do with the state, nothing to do with anything more broadly. But in the context of perestroika, that became untenable. And very, very rapidly, once the kind of cork was taken out of the bottle, it became a mass, not merely a mass event, but a mass event in consciousness, discourse, and discussion. And that achieved a number of things. First, it reinvented and reinvigorated the alliance between the Russian Orthodox Church and the state. Now, that had always been there to some extent in various ways, but it gave the church suddenly a voice within the state in which the church was to some extent an agenda setter rather than just an agenda follower. I mean, we know that during the war, the church was useful in mobilizing patriotism and so on, but it gave the church a kind of autonomous existence as an agenda-setting organization. And at the same time, being perestroika, it gave space for the kind of debates, discussions, and disagreements which had been kind of unthinkable previously, and it's difficult to remember how unthinkable they had been previously. I made, this is simply a personal reminiscence, I made in the time when BBC Radio had large budgets, I made 2 large radio documentaries at the time of the millennium, and they paid for me to go and interview people in Moscow, and interview people in St. Petersburg, and interview people in Kyiv, and interview the Pope's press secretary in Rome, and interview the cardinal of the Ukrainian, of the Uniate Church, of the Greek Catholic Church, also in Rome, which seemed to be then, still in 1987 I interviewed him, a kind of rather sad configuration of nostalgic people who, you know, who could imagine that within a very few years he'd be entering Lviv in particular in triumph. But this was, people were getting a stage, people were getting a voice which they hadn't had before. And what that led to, what that meant was, among other things, that when just a very few years later the Soviet Union collapsed, there were discourses which were ready. They weren't the only discourses which were possible. And since then other discourses have arisen, but the focus of discussion about Ukrainian identity and Russian non-Soviet identity in the late 1980s and early 1990s, not the only focus, but a significant focus, was this area released through talking about the millennium of Christianity. This became a big alternative self by chance, in a way. Who knows, had that millennium not happened then, perhaps something else would have been the focus of identities. And it meant that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were certain Ukrainian discourses which were ready not just in ideology or statements about national identity, but already to be embedded in cultural production in ways which are quite interesting now. And I'd like to show you almost in conclusion, not quite. Yes, well that's, what's that? Oh yes, that's, that's the 17th century. It's to show you, yes, Muscovy, the periods of expansion of the Russian Empire, and where we were in the 17th century, expanding into West Bank, Ukraine, and how, yes, well we know that, okay. So let's look at banknotes. And in 1991, immediately on independence, Ukraine had to issue its currency. And initially it had coupons, karbovanets. And it has this rather interesting figure of a woman on the left there. Who is she? Well, we look further, and that on the other side, we see the monastery of the caves in Kyiv. The woman is on the prow of that ship, and she's there with her brothers. Her name's Libid, and she's there with Khor, Shek, and Khoriv, who are the legendary founders of Kyiv. So this is a Ki, Shek, and Khoriv. It's a story of local foundation, local origins. Okay, look at the roundel on the left, and things begin to appear there. There's a sign there which appears. What's that sign? If one asks in Ukraine, one tends to be told it's the Ukrainian trident. Where does the Ukrainian trident come from? The Ukrainian trident, and we have it here on the other side as well, with the with the monastery of the caves. To look for the origins of it, we have to look back to the late 10th or early 11th century, and these are silver coins issued by Vladimir himself, and you look on the left, and this is that sign which appears on the banknotes is an indication of, it takes one straight back to the emblems of early Rus. Srebro, Srebro. You see here, I don't know if you can read it, but you will see there that he's called, if you look at the left, he's called Vladimir. That's not because he thought of himself as Russian. Now people get very worried about, Volodymyr is Ukrainian, Vladimir is Russian, one has to use the right one, and that is what they are now. But the origins are quite different. That Volodymyr, he would have been called Volodymyr certainly, it was East Slav standard pronunciation. How Vladimir then, nothing to do with Russian, that was the Church Slavonic form. So that was the kind of prestige form, hence it's Srebro rather than Serebro and so on. So this was, this was a form, so you can't say what's historically correct. One is colloquially historically correct, one is these were issued by him himself. And then modern, it's an example of how a notion of historical correctness imposes itself on modern consciousness, which has nothing to do with history. So these forms become emblematic of current positions, which are assumed to be embedded in history, but they're not. Anyway, the point is the trident. Then we move on and we see Volodymyr the monument appearing. So we've moved from simply local origins through to his currency symbol, through to him himself as appearing in the monument. And then eventually we move to the more, if you like, Ukrainianized figure of Volodymyr once we move beyond the coupons, the karbovancy, and we now have the hryvnia. And the hryvnia, why a hryvnia? Because the hryvnia or grivna was a unit of currency in early Rus. It was a weight of, you could have a hryvnia of silver or of squirrel furs. There were different standards in Kyiv, in Novgorod, in Suzdal, but that was the word. So in imagery, in symbol, in portraiture, and in the labeling even for the currency, early Rus is being brought into the consciousness as the principal signifier of independent Ukrainian identity. That is a choice. It doesn't have, could be all sorts of things, and currency since then has had all sorts of figures on them, but this was a marker right at the beginning. On the reverse of this, there's an interesting image as well. The ruins of Khersones, Crimea. No longer the monastery in Kyiv, but this is incorporating the ancient history, if you like, of Ukrainian lands. Now, the indigenous population of Crimea is a question mark. Are we talking about the Crimean Tatars, or are we talking about people well before the Mongols, or are we talking about the Genoese or the Venetians, and so on? Or the Greeks, Greek colonies in the Crimea, but this is Greek ruins in Crimea appearing on the reverse of that banknote. Okay, so is there a conclusion to all of this? Who is right? There isn't. These aren't really historical questions, and that's what I wanted to stress, I suppose. Thinking back to the beginning, to the three different concepts of what history is, I can offer an exploration of some of the events and processes in the past to which such claims allude. I can offer an explanation of how some of them came into being, but I can't offer a justification of any particular state's choice in selecting and structuring a notion of a desired past that fits their claims and aspirations for the present. These are ideologies of identity masquerading as history, and all too often and all too easily accepted as such. That's it, folks. Yes. So we have people online and we have people in the room. We'll start if there are questions, and I hope I've occasionally been kind of outrageous so people can object and say, how dare you say this or be so objectivist or whatever it happens to be. Why are you sort of spanning these and pretending everything's just a little objective puzzle? We'll start in the room. Elena has the microphone, and we need, please wait until you pass the microphone, because otherwise the people online can't hear you.
Hi there. I spent a couple of years working on the history of Soviet anti-religious propaganda, and I found examples of the Soviet magazine Bezbozhnik, Godless, from the 1920s that had rude caricatures of Prince Volodymyr,
Yep.
and highly satirical portraits of the baptism of Rus. I've read elsewhere that later on Prince Volodymyr got integrated into the Marxist view of history as a kind of objectively progressive force. I wonder if you could expand upon how Prince Volodymyr was depicted within the Soviet atheistic framework.
Yeah. Well, there were a number of strands to that. Medieval history did quite well in at least, not so much in the early Soviet period, not so much in the 30s, but did quite well from, particularly in the post-war period. And yes, I mean, the Soviets were not Taliban-type destroyers of everything to do with the past, because their ideology to some extent was based on a historical ideology which contextualized. And they didn't expect imperialists not to be imperialists. And everything looked both forward and back. And something could be, the phrase was, absolutely say, it was progressive in its time, but then was superseded by, because didn't realize that, etc., etc., etc. So it was actually rather important for the Soviet sort of formal Marxist historians to be able to show that the various Soviet nationalities, but obviously Russian was the dominant one, to show that Russia fitted the scheme of world history that in their interpretation of it, Marx, having a sense, just as the primary chronicle tries to show how it fits the biblical scheme. So you have a plan of world history. Marx invented it, so to speak, and somehow you end up with the first socialist country, which wasn't Marx's plan. So you have to find ways of showing how everything kind of fits. And that meant that there was a place for, so the big word for them was in the early period was not so much Vladimir himself, and certainly not so much Christianity, though Christianity insofar as it brought writing, insofar as it brought contact with the rest of the world, insofar as it brought the possibility of progression, so to speak. It had its progressive role. It meant, hey, we've reached the Middle Ages, where people are Christian and have writing. But the big thing was feudalism. And everyone had to go through their feudal stage. And there need to be early feudalism and mid-feudalism and late feudalism, just as there was early socialism and mid-socialism and mature socialism and all the rest of it. So they found a place for him. And it was a good and relatively safe place for some very talented scholars. And it was one of the few places where you could actually read religious texts. And quite a lot of religious texts got published under the banner of scientific atheism. Because those were simply the texts, and a lot of linguistic editions of what were religious texts, trying to kind of get away from the content, so to speak. But Vladimir himself, not so much a cult of personality. I mean, not, the kind of, you wouldn't have got the monument that you have now would have been completely unthinkable in the Soviet period. Couldn't happen.
Am I allowed to fire more than one question at you, or is it a limit of one per person?
No, say what you want, whatever you want. I may
One.
not answer more than one.
Great. One, on the coin from Rus that you showed.
Yep.
That's been
That's the
brought
first
into.
question. What's the second question?
So, trying to phrase this as neutrally as I
phrase
can.
it polemically.
In all of the, as you've mentioned, both Ukraine and Belarus do have their respective claims, and Russia does as well, to the legacy of Rus. Of those three, Russia's is really the only one which impinges on a neighbouring country. What would you say are some of the best, most effective counter-arguments for on the international stage at present to that issue?
They're two questions of very different nature. Let's take the linguistic one first. The historical phonology is a devilishly complicated subject, and I certainly wouldn't want to legitimize any current pronunciation on the basis of how people pronounce things 1,000 years ago, particularly because there were regional differences 1,000 years ago as well. There's a lot been written on Novgorod dialect, for example, which is somewhat different from, and Vladimir Volodymyr was Prince of Novgorod for a fair while before he was Prince of Kyiv, and so on. But it's probably closer to the technically unpalatalized form, that is to say, to what would now be Ukrainian form, because with the very sharp distinction you have in Russian between soft or hard, palatalized, unpalatalized, comes with, oh dear, the loss of semi-vowels or reduced vowels and the changing of the whole rhythm of the language, which is very slightly, it begins early, but it's sort of 12th, 13th centuries, but it's very difficult to trace it in actual speech because all we have is the written record, and we can see what is reflected in manuscripts, loosely or otherwise. As for counter-arguments, well, no, you could frame any of these mythologies to create claims if you wanted to. You could say there was a time when when Moscow is first mentioned in the Chronicles only in the mid-12th century in 1147. You could say there was a time when these places didn't exist. They were minor outposts subject to Kyiv, yeah? And so actually what should happen is that we should restore the position as it was in the 11th century. You could do. But the problem is when, I mean, the whole endeavor is corrupt in historical terms, in that, you know, if someone speaks of historic Russia or historic anything, you know, history is very long. And there's a historic Russia of the 15th century, 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, 19th century. What it means is that Russia which looked like what I would like it to look like now, which fits my aspirations. I was being slightly flippant, but not entirely flippant, to say it's the historic Mongol Empire, or that Crimea is historic Genoa, or historic Greece, or historic whatever. You know, you can take that template, and so I wouldn't. Once one starts arguing in the terms that the claim is put, one's actually conceding those terms, and the terms themselves are wrong. So, so what if Vladimir Volodymyr was baptized in Crimea? Why does that mean that Crimea needs to belong to anybody? I mean, it's weird in the West. It's not, these arguments from mystical history are not so strange in the Middle East, of course. There are places where sacred history is a template on which one tries to construct a present, and because these things happened a long time ago, you can construct many different kinds of, you know, there are overlapping sacred histories. And if you're stuck within that, you have problems. And so, okay, I mean, I think, you know, no, that's the answer to that question. I'm not going to move, you know, otherwise I'll move into larger issues. But I think it's not that you turn that argument against itself, it's just that the terms of the argument are an abuse of, they're not even a distortion of history, because you don't have, people sometimes say falsification of history. Falsification of history means saying things which happened which did not, or saying things did not happen which did. You can construct a myth entirely out of things which did happen. But it's treating it as a kind of smorgasbord of things which I like that happened, and things which correspond to the history I want. And that's not, you know, that has no, that's ideology. It has its own validity as an ideological statement. It may ring true with what people feel about themselves, and I think what's important to recognize here is that actually the period when these stories were just being copied and copied and copied and just became embedded and natural are absolutely as important as the times when they were deliberately ideologically transformed. There is no alternative narrative in the Russian tradition. You could perfectly well say that one should start a history of Russia from the late 14th century, from the 16th century, from Peter the Great or wherever. But that would take a lot of arguing. I mean, my purist view, coming back to the questions at the beginning, is that early Rus is neither Russian nor Ukraine. They didn't care about us, you know. We weren't there, they were. And it's fascinating to find out about that and what people have done with that legacy. But if people choose to teleport themselves into it, then, no. Anyway, yes. Other, yep. Hang on for the microphone so that people can hear online, and then we'll give the online people a chance.
You talked a bit about scholars from Kyiv creating an imperial narrative.
About, sorry?
Scholars from Kyiv creating an imperial narrative for Muscovy in the 60s. Is Christianity the only reason that Kyiv would be used and appropriated for that rather than, say, Novgorod, which was also a separate polity up until maybe the 15th, 16th century?
The reason that it's scholars from Kyiv helping to create that narrative is that, well, Novgorod is sometimes held up as an alternative history, so to speak, and certainly an alternative window onto Europe. I was last week in Hamburg, which was a Hanseatic centre. Novgorod was part of the Hanseatic trading nexus. There were German communities, merchant communities living in Novgorod for many hundreds of years, and so on. But in terms of, oddly, native learning, in terms of education systems, in terms of ideas, Novgorod remained very consistently traditional. The first time that Novgorod clearly begins to turn westwards in its learning is oddly right at the end of the 15th century, when Novgorod produces, Archbishop Gennady of Novgorod produces the first complete Slavonic translation of the Bible. It's rather odd that there was no complete Slavonic translation of the Bible until 500 years after the acceptance of Christianity, because you don't need a complete Bible, you need the liturgical Bible. But to do that, and they had most of it, but he had to turn to Western Latin and Germanic printed sources and import scholars to do that to some extent. But they had a very specific theological remit. Scholars from Kyiv were in a different position altogether. They were sophisticated in Latin and Greek, in Jesuit learning. They had substantial libraries. They knew about rhetoric. They could produce the first, they could produce verse. There was no medieval Muscovite verse. They produced on the basis of Polish syllabic verse, comes into Muscovy in the 17th century in Church Slavonic and then Russian. They could produce all sorts of elaborate verbal games. They knew about Western engravings. They produced them themselves. They had a visual vocabulary. It was a culture which was at a different kind of level to be flexible and service a Muscovite state which was beginning to get different ideas about itself. Whereas by the late 17th century, Novgorod was nothing. If it had happened in Novgorod, it would have to have happened earlier. It had already been wiped out, already been completely absorbed into the Muscovite state. But the Novgorod story is an interesting one in itself. One more here in the room, then we might ask people online. Yep. I feel almost like a modern auctioneer, where there's people in the room and then there's the people on the phones and on the internet and pressing their bids and so on. But we're still in the room with you, sir. Yes.
Roger Clark. Thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to ask about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. How did the Ukrainian Orthodox Church relate to the imperial narrative that the Russian Orthodox Church based in Moscow has endorsed?
Yeah, it depends when, and I certainly would not say that I'm an expert in the current Ukrainian Orthodox Church. I mean, the position of the Orthodox Church has been odd in those lands for quite a long time, even in the early Rus period. The Metropolitanate of Rossiya, as it was called, that was a Greek word which came in ecclesiastically and then was adopted in Muscovy later, had a far larger jurisdiction than any other metropolitan of the Eastern Church. Huge lands. You had, in most of the Byzantine lands, they were actually quite compact. But for some reason, the ecclesiastical authorities seemed keen to retain that enormous breadth of jurisdiction. So when in the 12th century, Andrei Bogolyubsky of Suzdal said, look, actually, we're different places now. You know, the various principalities had their own foreign policies, they had their own interests, their own local trading routes. Why don't we have our own church organization? Byzantium said no, absolutely not. So you had a single metropolitanate, which was a problem when the country was divided between the Mongol, the country, the space, Mongols on the one hand, Poland, Lithuania on the other, and should there still be a single metropolitan of Kyiv and all Rus, or should there be separate ones for separate church organizations? And the attempt right the way through the Middle Ages was to keep, in principle, a single organization. So once things were absorbed into the Russian Empire, there was really no question from the imperial point of view that there was no such thing as the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. This was part of the Russian Orthodox Church. What had happened in that period was that part of the Ukrainian Orthodox had accepted union with Rome in the dispensation, which allowed them to continue using their own liturgies. So that's the Uniates, or the Greek Orthodox Church. And it was rather assumed until right at the end of the Soviet period that that was entirely a political thing, and eventually they'd see sense and come back to the Orthodox Mother Church, but absolutely not, to become completely identified with a distinct thing. But so the current politics, I'm not an expert on. But Ukraine, of course, as you know, is a multilingual, multi-religious country. You have the Moscow Patriarch, you have the Ukrainian Autocephalous, you have two varieties of Catholic Church with the Greek Catholic Church and the Roman Catholic Church. And that is either a problem or it's what makes it a kind of interesting and vibrant place. And it can lead to tensions, but tensions are not necessarily bloody conflicts. Tensions can be vibrant and productive things.
We have a question from online, from Wanda Grace. How is Putin using the myth?
How is Putin using the myth? From Volodymyr to Vladimir. Putin, oh dear, not good. Pushkin House says that, is what I want to start, yes. Pushkin House is a good place to discuss these things. Putin, how is Putin using the myth? Putin is drawing on, and there's a lot of work done on a lot of aspects of this, not principally by me, so I want to be careful here, but he's drawing on a lot of embedded historical narratives to create his version of Russian nationhood in itself and territorial nationhood as a subset of that. I mean, the two don't have to be linked, but they are. Clearly, one of his narratives, particularly if we're talking about the south of Ukraine, is an 18th century narrative, much more to do with the later imperial map that I showed, because it's to do with Catherine the Great and, or from starting with Peter and the expansion into the southern steppe lands, and in particular this whole notion of Novorossiya and so on, is an 18th century notion, has nothing to do with early Rus. That was not Kyivan Rus lands. But how much more does one need than that extraordinary monument to Vladimir under the Kremlin walls, the biggest single statue in central Moscow? When Crimea was annexed, the fact that it was sacred Russian land because Vladimir, to whom he was about to put up a monument, had got baptized there, was part of the story. It's absolutely central that Kyiv, something which is quoted quite often by ideologies in Russia, Kyiv, will quote the primary chronicle, Kyiv is the Mать Russkих Городов, the mother of Russian cities, they call it. Mistranslation, of course, because first of all, Rus didn't then mean Russia, but it's a calque from Greek. Mать Городов is metropolis. It was the metropolis of Rus, so to speak, which it was. Had nothing to do with being the mother of the cities of Russia, but it's one of these things like the forms of names or whatever, which is taken over and a modern consciousness is superimposed. Crimea is interesting. The chronicle story says that Vladimir himself was baptized in Crimea. It's quite a complicated story, won't go into it, but it was part of, he wanted in return for providing some troops to help the Byzantine emperor out of a pickle, he negotiated for himself an imperial bride, the emperor's sister. Byzantines didn't like giving imperial brides to barbarians, but he had some leverage. They then reneged, so he said, okay, I'm going to come and take some of your territory in Crimea. They then acquiesced the deal. She came to Crimea. He then still hesitated, but anyway, there was a miracle and all sorts of things. But the Chronicle himself says, this is the story which we think is true, but some people say he was translated in Kyiv, he was baptized in Kyiv, some people say in Vushgorod, and other people say other things. So he was actually being an honest historian and saying there are various versions. This had happened 140 years before he was writing, and he was trying to say, we don't really know, but this is the version I'm coming up with. This becomes like a sacred text and is treated, Vladimir was baptized in Crimea, therefore Crimea is sacred Russian territory. It becomes like I don't know, think of the sacred sites of Jerusalem, which belong to many, many people. And yeah. So he's using the myth at all sorts of levels, and there's no question that, Donbass is not the heart of the myth. Crimea is in the myth, but Kyiv is the heart of the myth.
Any other questions? Well, then please join me in thanking you, Simon, for this fascinating talk.